All right, everybody. Without further ado, we're going to start our fourth session, fourth paper. Our presenter is Byron Davis, who is currently completing his MA in theology. Byron is a former executive on Wall Street for 30 years. He is the current owner of OG's Pizza and Brewing Company in Anaheim. Many of you have been there, especially during the Religious Ed Congress. Um, his,
Thank
ac-
you for the business, by the way.
his academic interest is specifically in, according to Byron, very early Christianity with concurrent interest in biblical languages. Our respondent today is Major Patrick Reimnitz of the United States Air Force, and I learned from Byron today he works on he's stationed in Salt Lake City developing advanced range threats. I'll let you ask him what that exactly means, 'cause I have a few questions. Patrick is also completing his MA in theology, is part of the class of 12 with Byron. His interests are in biblical studies, and he plans to do PhD work in the area. So without further ado, Byron.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't say to everybody that's in this room, in one way or another, you've had a great influence on my experience here as either a student or the faculty, and it's been an amazing experience, and I really do appreciate it. The riveting title of this presentation is The Role of Private, Communal, and Collective Property in the Yadah, Wealth, Property, and Piety in the Camps in Qumran. Do I have your attention? First of all, we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit. The uncovering of the remains of the settlements of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea and the Dead Sea Scrolls found nearby ignited the imagination of both Jewish and Christian scholars. In addition to the oldest copies of the Hebrew scriptures ever found and scrolls pertaining to the ancient community known as the Yadah, and I'm going to use the term Yadah and Essene interchangeably. In the scrolls themselves, they never refer to themselves to the Essenes, but only the Yadah, which usually means brotherhood. Known as the Yadah, numerous other objects were also discovered that depict the pious daily life and their disdain for those who did not adopt their way of life. The members of the sect saw themselves as the chosen of Israel. They believed that the other factions of Judaism, such as the Pharisees and Sadducees, should adopt their pious ways. Their separatist nature led them to the northern sea of the Dead Sea at Qumran, although groups of those seeking the way of the light, called initiatives, lived throughout all of Judea, including Jerusalem. Historians of the period described the group as abandoning the world's pleasures and living as a commune to which they donated all their wealth. But in my view, this is very simplistic. The management of their wealth, the economic systems they employed, like trade with the non-Yadah, and the meticulous commingling of assets as the initiate grows in purity do not support a view of communal commingling of assets in anticipation of a cataclysmic end of the world as is commonly portrayed. Although seemingly pacifist in nature, they believed they were preparing for a great final war in which the Katim, by the way, means anybody but them. These people didn't like anybody. The Katim would be destroyed. They were preparing for a social and religious revolution that would lead Israel back to the law of Moses that they had felt had been defiled by the Hasmoneans. It's not surprising then that the Dead Sea Scrolls, so full of apocalyptic imagery like angels mating with earthbound beings, and the popular view that the War Scroll is the blueprint for the final Armageddon, it will be viewed in a similar light as the Christian interpretation of the book of Revelation in the New Testament. I contend, however, that this view is not supported in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The apocalypse is not the end of time. There is no cosmic destruction, but is instead the revelation of the end of an era of unrighteousness and defilement by the sons of darkness. The eschaton for them was a return to strict adherence to the Mosaic law and the purity of the first temple, foretold by the coming of the dual messiahs. For instance, even secular issues like the ownership of private property and day-to-day economic activities will once again be dictated by the Torah, not by one's own particular brand of Judaism. To the Yadah, the way of the Yadah is the only true law. According to Catherine Murphy in her book, Wealth in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ways in which a group coordinates the production of goods and services implicate the political assumptions, the social locations, and the ideological frameworks of the group, just as they help to shape them. The ideological framework of any group then provides valuable clues to both its secular and religious practices. John Locke, in his book Property, combines the sacred nature of God's gifts with the profane need to distribute these gifts to their highest and best use. Quoting Locke, "God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. Though all the fruits it naturally produces and beasts it feeds belong to mankind in common, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or another before they can be of any use or at all beneficial to any particular man." Almost 2,000 words separate the pen words of John Locke from the sparse desert community at Qumran. It's as if he was looking back in time, speaking about its mysterious inhabitants, which I said we will call the Yahads, or as they describe themselves, the Yahad, as they struggle to balance the role of ownership of private property with religious purity. As we examine the role of commerce, and particularly the manner in which property is treated in the Zadokite fragments, and the role of the community scroll, it is sufficient for our purposes to assume that these laws were meant to be followed by some sectarian group, and the physical location of the group is of lesser importance. For our discussion, Lawrence Schiffman puts the matter to rest when he says, "There is now too much evidence proving that the community that collected the scrolls emerged out of a sectarian conflict, and that conflict sustained it through its existence. Qumran was not a villa, a fortified estate, or a commercial enterprise, but rather the hub of a religious and economic network that extended along the northwest coast of the Dead Sea to Jericho and throughout Judea. The relatively low number of coins, ostraca, and documentary texts compared to other Judean desert sites indicated this economic network was largely characterized by barter between members rather than by purchase and sale with others. However, we will see that commerce with the non-Yahad was common and frequent, though the practice was heavily regulated. In addition to the pottery facilities, the grain for storage silos, the mining facilities, and the furnace at Qumran, as well as the date palm orchard, all testified to an extended community that met most of its own needs and most likely produced a surplus. Like Locke, the Essenes firmly placed God at the center of their economic system, but individual responsibility is not cast aside, and they almost maniacally search for a balance of private, collective, and communal property ownership that coincided with the ever-escalating religious purity of the initiate that determined the extent that the initiate would even be allowed the opportunity to contribute his private property to the communal good. This talk will show that it's time to discard the notion that the residents at Qumran embraced poverty. What they embraced was not a lack, but a lack of need. And this goal was met through a common and relatively austere lifestyle with a marrying measure of centralized control, an open but religiously restricted economy. The economic structure at Qumran was undoubtedly typical of Palestine in the Hasmonean period. Wealth appears to refer to food and land more than it does to money or commodities such as livestock or movable property. Grain crops and slaves were the private property of the individual, and wealth will be understood to be those assets which enable one to produce goods as well as the goods thus produced. The discussion of economics will focus on the matter of shared property known to us from the rule of the community scroll, with the caveat the Damascus document, that would be for those living outside the religious community at Qumran, is quiet on the matter of shared property, which is not surprising given the initiate's low status. Numerous references in the Zadokite fragments confirm the practice of private ownership of the sect. In one passage, there is an explicit reference to the system of voluntary offering to the temple, and a practice of another practice of actually mentioning a donation of a private field to the temple. Property in general is held in three different and distinct ways. Although we'll see that the Yadah at Qumran and the camps, industry utilized all three, concurrent with the advancement of the initiate in the ways of the Yadah, and whether he resided in the secular center at Qumran or the outlying philosophical camps. The Zadokite fragments and the Rule of the Community scroll describe a detailed set of rules for the management of property that must have included a fairly complicated accounting system. This systematic conversion from private property to common property to collective property is demonstrated as the initiates mature in the understanding and the way of the light. Numerous passages in both documents indicate that the Yadah engaged in trade with non-sect members, with certain limiting clauses to maintain the purity of its sect. It is probable that these passages give us a glimpse into the practice of commingling resources in concert with the practice of individual ownership of property, as well as the probable practice of dealing with non-sectarian, non-Yadah shared means of production like a communal wine press. We can begin then to look through the lens of commerce with those outside the Yadah to further illuminate the role of private property, and further the argument that the sect did have substantial communal wealth due in part to its austere lack of need of the community. We will now examine how the economic model of the Yadah incorporated the concurrent progression of purity and the retention and redefinition of private, communal, and collective property. One of the most commonly held beliefs about the Qumran community is that they practice communism of property. That is, all property was corporately owned. Depending upon the level of purity the member attained, this is only partially accurate. The Zadokite fragments discuss issues about property from a different viewpoint than the rule of the community. The rule of the community presents regulations applicable only to the sectarian center at Qumran, and the Zadokite fragments address the small communities located throughout the country. So the mandates regarding the commingling of assets differ. The first obligation from incoming members is the prohibition from buying and selling with others. The sons of darkness, they're called. Like I said, they didn't like anybody. But rather conveys goods only in kind, from hand to hand, as they're only allowed to deal in cash. One further financial stipulation bound the initiate and sectarian members. They are not to do anything involving buying and selling without informing the examiner of the camp. These multiple references to commercial transactions in their place at the head of the list of obligations incumbent upon members demonstrates a significant amount of economic obligations within the community. Financial relations with the community and between it and the outside world manifests symbolic importance of the community's identity. It creates the image of a practical, aesthetic community that realized the basic economic necessity of commerce, but the sons of darkness without defiling themselves. This extensive holding of property that is subject to the control of its owner yet held in common does not fully eliminate the notion that the camps in the center at Qumran were ascetic, even monastic in its religious practice, but this does indicate that they were actively involved in trade and did not embrace poverty, but as I said, rather embraced a lack of need, contributing further to the growth of the community's holdings. The material in the Zadokite fragments, usually regarded as the rules for the camp, as I said, shows beyond a doubt that the society envisioned here was to be based on private property and private enterprise. Remember, these are the newest initiates. According to Lawrence Schiffman, in describing the Zadokite fragments, and I quote, "Indeed, not even a hint of any aspect of communal property can be found in the work," end quote. The Zadokite fragments contain regulations that a member must obtain the approval of the examiner before entering into any type of business transaction. He deals with the community member's acquisition or misappropriation of property and its subsequent use to adjudicate claims regarding its property. The requirement that the member had to have the approval of the examiner would suggest that even as the property of the members were commingled, they still retained some control over its use. The purpose of the examiner in matters of commerce was intended as a safeguard against errors of judgment and the violation of important commercial laws of the sect and the Torah. More importantly, this reiterates that the members of the Zadokite camps and the inhabitants of the Qumran community retained ownership and authority over their own property, which was simultaneously considered part of the abundance of the Yadah. The Rule of the Community scroll is the most heavily attested scroll in the entire Qumran corpus, with fragments from numerous different caves validating the other scrolls found that were similar to the scroll of the instructor found in Cave 1. I believe there were 8 copies. If we look at the Rule of the Community scroll, we can see the mechanics of the spiritual conversion process from initiate to Yadah, and the concomitant evolution of complete private property ownership to private ownership of property with a communal and collective use. I'm going to read a quote. It's a little lengthy, but this basically comes from the Rule of the Community, and this, I think more than anything else, kind of sums up really what these non-sectarian documents or the sectarian documents are about. So this is a direct quote from the scrolls. If he has potential for instruction, he is to begin initiation into the covenant, returning to the truth, and repenting all perversity. Further, he must not yet admix his property with that of the general membership. If it be ordained, in the opinion of the priests and the majority of the men of the covenant, then he shall be initiated further into the sect of the Yadah. They shall also take steps to incorporate his property, putting it under the authority of the overseer, together with that of the general membership, and keeping an account of it, but it shall not be distributed along with that of the general membership. If it be ordained for him to proceed to full membership in the Yadah, they should enroll him at the appropriate rank among his brothers for discussion of the law, jurisprudence, participation, and admixture of property. We see then in the concurrent commingling of property with the increasing attainment of the piety of the initiate. The matter of perceived value of property then can be ascribed to the community. Further evidence that the community at Qumran as well as the camps did not embrace poverty, but assigned a realistic and pragmatic value to the assets of the initiate. So important was this evaluation of the initiate's financial situation that the duty of its administration was removed from the individual and assigned to an overseer, an examiner, to aid the initiate in achieving higher and higher levels of purity. Another discipline, sociology, describes communal as loyal to the interests of one's own ethnic group rather than to the society of a whole. When any and all members of a society hold property in common, the rules regarding the management of property favor making them available for use by all. Any restriction that is placed on its use when property is held in common is simply to secure equal access for all and to prevent anyone from using the common resource in a way that would preclude its use by others. Given this definition, it would seem that in the strictest sense that, to the Yadah, the distinction between the two is far more than semantic, and the difference between the Rule of the Community and the Damascus document do in fact encompass varying degrees of private, communal, and collective property, which existed at different stages of the initiate's increasing or decreasing levels of purity. The third way in which the Essenes held property was collectively. Collective property is different here. Here the community as a whole determines important how issues are to be used. These determinations are made on the basis of the social interest through the mechanism of collective decision-making. Anything from a leisurely debate among the elders of a tribe to the formation of a Soviet-style 5-year plan. Various passages from the Rule of the Community and the Damascus document portray overlapping ways in which the Yadah held property. The voluntary offerings of wealth entitled the initiate to make certain claims on the communal resources, as well as to retain a claim on his own property. We saw earlier in the rites of the initiation where the incremental contribution of property and the gradually increasing claims of the community as well as the initiate's claim upon the property deposited are symbol of the individual's assimilation into the community, as well as their increasing separation from the men of deceit. It becomes clear from the body of the document that property and wealth were not only the original contribution of immovable assets, but also anything that the initiate will produce in the future. This implies that the voluntary offering of wealth and property gave the initiate the right to make claims on some of the communal property, while continuing to exercise some degree of control over their own personal property, whether it be their initial contribution or a portion of their future labor. Further evidence of the collective aspect of wealth and property is shown in the role of the examiner and the necessity to take annual accounting of the members of the Yadah. The second section of 1QS grants the examiner possession over all the collective and communal property, but that each member bore responsibility to manage individual and communal assets as well. The fact that an individual member could act negligently with the wealth of the community indicates that members retained roles related to the management of communal assets. This may simply mean that their individual work and productivity was understood as community property, so they were exercised not only in their own self-interests, but also with the ideologies and regulations of the community in mind. It also indicates that individual members had some capacity to make restitution for the loss of communal property, which may mean that they retained some of their own property or their work could generate the income necessary to compensate for a loss. Imagine for the moment the complex job of the examiner. This is from the Rule of the Community. Then if the decision shall go forth to bring him near the community, then he, the examiner, shall register, which means literally write, him in the list, in his proper place among his fellows, for Torah, judgment, and purity, and to mingle his property. Then his counsel will be for the community as well as his judgment. Forgetting for a moment his religious duties to the Yadah, let's look at a seemingly simple transaction involving the acquisition, administration, and distribution of a single initiate's property that began the camps. When the initiates first entered the Yadah, he has complete control over his property until he is deemed worthy to advance in the Mosaic tradition. After this milestone, a gradual process of the commingling of assets takes place. If the initiate is deemed unworthy, his property, until unspecified time, reverts back to him. If his fellow members continue their approval and his rank has progressed into the second year, another schedule applies. So the examiner must create some kind of wealth property amortization schedule that is highly flexible, depending upon the initiate's progress. The number of possible permutations on the measure of both the wealth and property owned at any given time of period by the individual and the Yadah would seem daunting even to those with the latest version of Excel. To completely understand the complexity of the ledger, so remember, we've got people entering, we have people leaving, some of their properties being distributed, some of their properties being taken away. It's pretty complicated. But to add to the complication, to completely understand the complexity of the ledger accorded to each member of the Yadah, interject the additional calculation required of all Jews to keep the Mosaic tenets of the Jubilee year, where every 49th year, all property reverts to its owner at the time of the last Jubilee. And since these are the most pious of the pious, I think we can only assume that they probably did adhere to the rules of the Jubilee. So in conclusion, sectarian life for the Essenes revolved around a complex system of initiation procedures which required a strict adherence to their interpretation of the Mosaic law. These procedures were intertwined with the attainment of both inner spiritual purity and the commingling of private property. Their model of private property and its administration is quite unique from other forms of Judaism during the Second Temple period and aids us in our understanding of the events that helped to shape early Christianity. Sectarian practices usually require the complete transference of one's property prior to admission. Such is not the case with the Essenes. They devise an eloquent system that retains the best elements of private, communal, and collective property. In terms of sheer volume of the scroll material, matters of wealth and property are only second to canonical and non-canonical biblical texts. Such was the importance of the laws concerning wealth that they stand firmly as the second pillar of sectarian life for the Yadah. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Byron, for your presentation on the role of private, communal, and collective property in the Yadah. It was very informative and enlightening. Your paper does a nice job demonstrating that, contrary to popular belief, the Yadah did not embrace poverty. Rather, they embraced a lack of need. You show that the motivation behind the economic system of the Essenes was to maintain ritual purity, not to achieve an ideal of poverty, as later Christian monastic groups did. You present evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls to show how only those who attained the proper level of purity were allowed to commingle their personal property with that of the Ahad. You also did a nice job of demonstrating that individual members retained some form of ownership of their personal property. Joining the Yadah did not mean a surrendering of all material possessions. In fact, according to the rule of community scroll, a new initiate was not to admix his property with that of the general membership. Only as he matured in his understanding in the way of light did his property systematically convert from private to communal and then to collective ownership. But even then, a Yadah member still retained control over its use. My main criticism of your paper is that it lacks a strong thesis. You provide an excellent introduction that sparks the reader's interest, building the foundations for what appears to be a comparison between the apocalyptic views of the Yadah and early Christian communities. In what seems to be your thesis statement, you claim that the Yadah end times belief is altogether different from that of Christianity as it is presented in the book of Revelation. However, after the introduction, you never again broached the subject. Given the context of the rest of your essay, it feels as if these two paragraphs on apocalyptic beliefs are out of place. Following what seems to be a second introduction, you finally state on page 5 what appears to be the true thesis of your paper, that, quote, "it is time to discard the notion that residents at Qumran embrace poverty," unquote. Your essay would have been easier to follow if you had more clearly stated your thesis earlier in the paper and then laid out a roadmap of the main points you plan to discuss. This would have made your paper flow much more smoothly. While your essay is very informative, I would have liked to have seen you go beyond just the facts. A comparison of the Yadah with the early Christian community, such as the one described in Acts chapter 4, would have been interesting to explore. Luke describes the first Jerusalem Christians as being, quote, "of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common," unquote. Was the early church influenced by the Yadah? In my opinion, while at first glance the two communities appear to be similar, I would argue that they are in fact different systems altogether. According to your analysis, members of the Yadah retained individual property rights even while the property was collectively controlled. The book of Acts, meanwhile, says that in the early Christian community, no one claimed private ownership of any possessions. Another difference between the Yadah and the early church was that the former was motivated to embrace communal living by a desire to maintain ritual purity. They went into the desert to avoid defilement by the sons of darkness. By contrast, the early church was motivated by love of neighbor and the expectation of the imminent parousia. The current world was passing away, and the coming kingdom would reverse the trends of wealth and power in the current system. As Luke writes in the Magnificat, "He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent away the rich empty-handed." Given this worldview, taking care of the poor and not maintaining ritual purity was the reason for communal living for the early Christian church. One was to use one's possessions to support fellow believers who have need. I would also like to have seen you describe how the Yadah applied the Jubilee laws to their community. According to the biblical prescriptions, the year of Jubilee returned land to its original owners and freed slaves to their original clans. The Torah does not specifically address possessions. Did the Essenes take the Jubilee legislation as being applicable to the possessions that individual members had integrated into the group? And if so, what effect did this have on the community? Finally, in your opinion, are there any principles from the Yahad's economic system that can be applied today? What would the Essenes think of socialist policies that force members of a society to relinquish ownership of their private property for use by another? Does the Yadah model offer a practical alternative to our current way of business, or is its usefulness limited to small, homogeneous communities? Thank you.